Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, in this lecture, we're going to be continuing our conversation on the evolution of gaming. In 1983, we had the video game crash. And so the marketplace is in a period of vast turbulence and transition. Consumers are kind of over gaming. There are so many consoles in the marketplace, and there are video game arcades that are kind of everywhere. So there's consumer exhaustion from playing all of these devices, as well as trying to figure out what console requires a cartridge, or what video game console comes preloaded with video games. Now, thankfully, Nintendo, which started out as a playing card company, comes in and saves the day. And so they enter the marketplace with the Nintendo Entertainment System, and they have a video game companion with the video game console featuring, of course, Super Mario himself. So let's get started. With the Nintendo Entertainment System, we can see here an 8-bit Super Mario. So Mario's look was deemed to look that of a plumber. This was not necessarily done intentionally, as his original form, Jumpman in the original Donkey Kong, was slated to be a carpenter. But after some conversations at Nintendo, it was deemed that Mario, in fact, looked more like a plumber than a carpenter. And additionally, Super Mario's brother, Luigi, is also introduced here. One story has it that Luigi's name is taken from an Italian restaurant in Redmond, Washington at the time, which is where Nintendo of America was headquartered, and the name of the restaurant was Mario and Luigi's. And so it made sense to bring along Luigi into the video game. Additionally, it allowed people to play in couples. And so there was player 1 who could play as Super Mario, and there was player 2 who could play as Luigi. Now in the 1980s, as we stated earlier, we had the video game market kind of dissipating briefly. We have distributors who could not pay banks back with money earned from arcades or money earned from consoles. There's oversaturation and wide variation in quality. So Nintendo is truly taking a cataclysmic risk in opening up into the video game marketplace and offering the Nintendo Entertainment System. However, the Nintendo Entertainment System does perform exceptionally well in the marketplace. Let's move along. The development of the NES. So Nintendo, as stated in the last lecture, was the Japanese distributor for the Magnavox Odyssey, the first video game console that was meant for the home, just before Atari came out with its own slate of consoles. And so Nintendo had been looking into video game consoles for about 8 years before the Nintendo Entertainment System is introduced into the marketplace. And so Nintendo Entertainment System does a few things. For one, there's a directional pad. You can go up, you can go down, you can go left, you can go right. The down and up sometimes signifies jumping and ducking. It was dependent upon the game itself. Left to right allowed players to complete side-scrolling video games. It's those video games that kind of start you on the left-hand side of the screen and you're constantly walking toward the right. It was fashioned in that manner because we read left to right. So as consumers, it was very, very easy to get involved in the gameplay offered from these video games. The directional pad itself is used from the Game & Watch series that was developed by Gunpei, as stated in the last lecture. The buttons allowed consumers to be able to attack seamlessly. And so it was very easy to use your left hand to kind of help direct your character and your right hand to push the 2 red buttons that are featured at the bottom of the screen. There were also start and select buttons to pause video gameplay and to access a menu. So again, the Nintendo Entertainment System helps push forward consumer control. Consumers are no longer relegated to a joystick, which sort of allows for 360-degree, although frustrating, movement in video games, and one button, which is usually either an attack button or a jump button. By Nintendo innovating with 2 additional red buttons here, players are able to engage the video game more in depth. Video games are able to be more complex in nature. I want you to kind of take a look at the Nintendo Entertainment itself. It's red, it's black, it's white, and it's gray. what else during this time has that particular color scheme? VCRs, cable boxes, TV boxes, right? The Nintendo Entertainment System was colored so that it would look as though it belonged in the living room. This was done deliberately by Nintendo. It did not look like a colorful toy. It is not coated in pink. It's not coated in yellow or blue or green or purple. It's very deliberately made to look like, oh, this belongs next to a VCR. This belongs next to a TV set. So again, Nintendo begins to educate consumers that the Nintendo Entertainment System is an electronic device. It is not a device that is simply meant for children, even though the Nintendo Entertainment System is sold to children. There's something else that's interesting that happens here. Toy retailers are kind of on the ropes with video games, and so Nintendo goes around trying to sell video game consoles. At first, they have a lot of difficulty, and we'll get into that a little bit in a second. They eventually have success with the Nintendo Entertainment System. They have a decision to make, though. In the 1970s, toy aisles typically were unisex. So if you had a child in the 1970s, you'd walk down the same aisle, whether you had a daughter or whether you had a son. Wouldn't matter. In the 1980s, we go back to having gender-specific clothes, gender-specific toys, and so the pendulum, the cultural pendulum, swings in back toward designating toys and clothes based on gender. And so girl toy aisles and boy toy aisles manifest in the 1980s. This was not a decision that video game companies had in the past. And remember, all other video game console entrants are kind of shrinking back from the marketplace, not really eager to re-enter. They're still kind of wounded from what happened in 1983. Nintendo has a decision to make. We're probably not going to put our console in the electronics aisle, even though it's colored as such. We know that our main market is children. We have a boy aisle. We have a girl aisle. Some of you already know what is about to transpire. Nintendo picks the boy aisle. And as a result of picking the boy aisle, Nintendo sets a tone and a precedence for video games being a boy toy. That's really how it started. There were many, many women engineers and computer science folks behind a lot of the video games that were being made in the 1980s and in the 1970s. But despite that, Nintendo's election to go into the boy aisle to sell the video game console really to set a precedence for video games being a boy thing and a male thing. And only recently, maybe over in the last 5 to 7 years, has the video game industry made strides in really shedding that kind of label and really re-inviting and reigniting interest among female video game players. Let's go back to the next slide. And so Nintendo Entertainment System struggles at first. Toys R Us, KB Toys, a lot of these big chain retailers are not that enthused about Nintendo. They're already licking their wounds from the 1983 market meltdown. So toy manufacturers are typically, at this point, housed in New York City. So Nintendo has an idea. What if we featured our console at FAO Schwarz? FAO Schwarz, for those of you who are not familiar, is a boutique specialty toy company that had recently, actually as of this airing, been reintroduced into the marketplace. The toy company had closed some decade ago, but it has recently come back due to investors who have pulled money together to relaunch the store itself. So FAO Schwarz in the 1980s is a specialty toy company and toy shop in New York City. You went there if you were going to find novelty toys, really expensive toys, specialized toys, toys you probably wouldn't find at a retailer or a mass retailer. And so Nintendo starts going to, FAO Schwarz, and what they wind up doing is they offer FAO Schwarz, if none of the NES consoles sell, they'll buy them back, which is absolutely unheard of. Typically, retailers buy product and then try to sell them. But if you're a Nintendo and you've already sold the consoles to Toys R Us, the onus is on Toys R Us to sell the rest. That's on them. Nintendo technically has already made their money because Toys R Us paid for the product, and then they're going to sell it at a higher price so that they can accrue some sort of profit. And so Nintendo makes this promise. The toy itself at FAO Schwarz does exceptionally well. It begins to move on to other retailers slowly, and Nintendo begins to pick up traction. In 1986, Nintendo sells about 3 million consoles. In 1987, it doubles it. And so for a brief moment in the 1980s, from about 85 to about 89, Nintendo is the unheralded champion of the video game marketplace. And a lot of other toy manufacturers are seeing this and taking notice that the video game industry hasn't died. It's instead evolved. New standards are introduced here, and Nintendo becomes a real stickler for quality and standards. So much so that in the NES console, there's a chip that allows it to only play Nintendo chipped video games. And so if you are a third-party vendor, a third-party video game developer, and you want to develop a video game for Nintendo, you have to get a license, and you also have to purchase chips to put in your video game so that they are playable on the NES. This allows Nintendo to control first standards, quality, the kind of gameplay they think is indicative of Nintendo as well. This is a major departure from previous video game console companies in which they were just really more eager to design something that they thought that they could sell rather than worry about quality and standards. After all, this was a product for children. Could children really discern differences in gameplay and quality? And obviously the truth is yes, overwhelmingly so. And so that was a hard lesson that was learned by those companies, but Nintendo was able to capitalize on here. Let's go to the next slide. Nintendo begins to innovate because some people kind of want their video games on the go. And Nintendo knows this because back in the early 1980s, they had the Game & Watch games. So they're very, very much used to handheld portable games. This is kind of interesting. It's a new learned media behavior, after all. So we had some people who in the past had played, handheld video games for sure. But at this point, they hadn't played handheld video games that were sophisticated or markedly sophisticated or notably sophisticated from just kind of average handheld, video games. The Game Boy is a major advancement because it does play like a console. Even though the screen is very, very tiny, it does have the gameplay and sophistication of a video game console. And that really was one of the hallmarks of the Game Boy in trying to take away what was going on in living rooms, in stationary consoles, and being able to do more with it. And so this handheld console combined video game console power with the portability of the Game & Watch games. Multiple cartridges meant that consumers would not need to purchase many, many different games. And so multiple cartridges could be held and carried here alongside the video game itself. And so not only could you carry multiple cartridges in the video game Game Boy bag that came with the Game Boy, but on these cartridges there were often multiple video games that were featured here. You also had earbuds and strong battery packs that were equipped for intimate experiences. And so Game Boy really helps educate an entire generation. You can bring your video games with you, you can manipulate the reality around you, and you can play video games at the grocery store. You can play video games on your way to driving to Disneyland or Disney World. You can play video games while you're driving toward going to the beach for a day. And so it also allowed video games to get out of living rooms and to really market themselves as really the first kind of portable entertainment since music and print. Film and TV at this point are still kind of behind. You can't take a movie with you. You really can't take a TV show with you. DVDs and portability are coming, but at this point, video games really does make inroads in consumer behavior, really educating people that interactive entertainment doesn't have to be on a ginormous screen. It can simply be in the palm of your hand. And so consumers are endowed with this major, major sense of control, being bigger than the screen and being able to really control what goes on. Additionally, the Game Boy advances further and allows for people who own Game Boys to be able to play with each other. This takes off especially with video games like Pokemon and things of that sort. Let's move along. So, at this point, and I know that I've skipped Sega here, and I've skipped Sega here on purpose because Sega, although exceptionally popular, was a flash in the pan. Sega didn't really capitalize on what it had at the time, and ultimately is kind of torn down by Nintendo, Sony, and other players in the marketplace. But I can pause to talk a little bit about Sega. Sega comes along as Service Games. And Service Games is a video game company that is in Hawaii and takes care of carnivals and arcades and other items. And so Service Games takes wind of what's going on with all of these video game consoles and winds up hiring Tom Kalinske, a Mattel toy executive, to come in and help them innovate a video game console. The Sega Genesis winds up coming out as a result of this. Now, its video game designers are tasked with trying to create a video game titular character, a character that can kind of compete with Mario. And so animals and other things are kind of thrown around. A hedgehog is mentioned by one of the designers, and lo and behold, Sonic is developed and implemented as the marquee character that represents Sega. Sega is heralded as fast, as kind of rock and rollish, as really a rebellious kind of video game console. And it works for a time. Sega Genesis does well, Sega Saturn does well. But as we move along with Sega Dreamcast, Sega gets a little away from its marketplace. Sega winds up having smaller and smaller video game libraries, which really does undermine the appeal. Sega Dreamcast is able actually to connect to the internet, but nobody really knows what that means or what that can do for them in 1997. The internet is still a very, very new thing, and to have a video game console be able to connect to the internet really doesn't do much for consumers. Again, they haven't been educated on what the internet really can do for them, so they don't really know how to exploit that feature on the console. And so Sega is kind of this tragic story in which it is a flash in the pan. It rocks pretty hard from 1990 to about 1994, 95. But really with the advent of Sony and with Nintendo pushing along, its success is quickly trampled on and stamped out in subsequent generations. Let's go back to the slide. Nintendo creates more competition. So as Sega is giving Nintendo a run for its money, briefly, Nintendo begins a relationship with Sony in 1988 to develop a CD-ROM based on video game consoles. The problem here is that there's not enough room. And so Nintendo has to figure out another way to circumvent this. And so CD-ROMs can offer more RAM, more memory for video game design. Sony wants to create the Super Disc and license Nintendo games. And so Sony would probably have more control over this console than Nintendo. And Nintendo realizes this in the laid out agreement. So Nintendo's not so hot over this. They would lose its control over its video games, and Sony would be able to earn sole licensing fees. That was not something Nintendo wanted to get behind. After all, it had brandished its reputation on stellar video gameplay and really, really strong relationships with its third-party vendors. So at the 11th hour, right before the deal is finalized, Nintendo leaves Sony for Philips, and then leaves Philips, and goes ahead on its own to develop the N64. Now, if you're Sony and you have the blueprints for the Nintendo PlayStation, you wind up building it yourself, don't you? So Sony decides to get further involved and winds up creating the Sony PlayStation instead of the Nintendo PlayStation. So indirectly, Nintendo creates another competitor in the marketplace. Let's go to the next slide. And PlayStation indirectly creates another competitor. And so engineers at Microsoft begin analyzing Dell laptop computers. After all, it's a software company, and video games run on software. They see what Sony does, and Sony traditionally was a hardware company. It made sense for them to invest in a video game console. But Microsoft also recognizes that software really is a big component of gaming. And so Microsoft begins to lose its engineers who are leaving Microsoft to go work for Sony on the upcoming PlayStation 2. And as a result, Microsoft begins to get involved in gameplay, in part just to keep its workforce, because so many of its computer science engineers are fascinated and interested in working in the video game sphere. The Halo franchise also comes out as Xbox's kind of marquee franchise to help market itself. Let's move along. To get a better sense of what's transpired across these three companies, it's kind of important to look at sales. Now, these are video game unit sales in millions across all of the major franchises of Nintendo. So for Super Mario Brothers, across every Mario game that's ever come out, Nintendo currently sits at about 627 million units sold. For all of the Pokemon games, we have about 301 million sold. For Wii, it's 203, Zelda's at 105, and Donkey Kong is at 75.6. You'll probably recognize the Game & Watch franchise that I referenced earlier. Super Smash Bros. At 40, Kirby at 38, and Brain Age at 34. So really what you can see here is that Nintendo has really, really strong intellectual property, more so really than the other competitors, namely Microsoft and Sony for that matter. So it really is in a very unique place because it's able to constantly exploit its stable of characters that are readily recognized and beloved by so many consumers. Let's see who else is selling video games here. So with Microsoft, you can see here, Kinect Adventures, oddly enough, is the best-selling Microsoft video game. And Kinect Adventures dealt with the Xbox 360 and the Kinect, which was kind of a response to the Nintendo Wii that kind of had the motion capture technology. Microsoft had raced to kind of mimic that. And for those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, if any of you have ever played the Wii, you know that you can kind of control the video gameplay itself by your own body, right? The Nintendo Wii tracks your body movement. Kinect Adventures was Microsoft's response to that, allowing people once again to get up and to play, but only with Microsoft games. Grand Theft Auto 5 is featured here as well, and we know that Grand Theft Auto 5, by far and away, was one of the greatest selling Grand Theft Auto installations of all time. The rest of the video games featured here are a hodgepodge of Call of Duty and Halo, which should come as no surprise. Microsoft tends to skew more adult, more teenager focused consumers for that matter. And so their video games tend to be graphic, a little bit more adult oriented as well. Let's move along here. And so as you can see with Sony's PlayStation, it's the same deal here. Sony PlayStation and Microsoft's Xbox, all of these consoles typically focus around violence, competition, a little bit more adult themed, a little bit more adult edged in nature. And so here you can see for the first few columns, the Grand Theft Auto series has been very, very good to PlayStation as well. In particular, San Andreas is the highest selling PlayStation video game of all time, followed by Grand Theft Auto 5, followed by Vice City. We have some Call of Duty there, and so it's kind of more of the same here. We have Gran Turismo also featured here as well, which is one of the most recognizable franchises for the PlayStation itself. Let's move along. Nintendo video game console sales. Believe it or not, the Nintendo DS is the highest selling handheld console for Nintendo, and arguably the highest selling console if you combine handheld and stationary consoles together. But if you're interested in which console sells the best, you can see in the third bar, Nintendo Wii is the highest selling stationary video game console for Nintendo. And so it's kind of interesting to see that it's really the handheld consoles that have done so well for Nintendo, but it should be noted that the Nintendo Wii, the NES, both did markedly well in the video game marketplace here. And it really does illustrate that Nintendo really does have its hands in both handheld and stationary consoles. And it makes sense that Nintendo continues to be a perennial powerhouse in handheld video gameplay. Let's move along here. With the Sony video game console sales, Sony marginally beats out the Nintendo DS with its PlayStation 2. which is the highest selling video game console of all time across handheld devices, across stationary devices. It is the PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2 allowed consumers to play DVDs, which was a huge, huge deal at the time. Many people were fascinated by it. PlayStation 2 really did make and take steps to be an all-out entertainment console. We know that the Nintendo Entertainment System presented itself as just that, an entertainment system back in 1985, but it wasn't playing VCR tapes. It wasn't playing music or anything like that. On the PlayStation 2, you could play CDs, you could play DVDs. It really was genuinely an entertainment system and really helped consumers learn that you can use a video game console for a whole host of things. It doesn't just have to be a video game experience that you're looking for. As we move down on this chart, you can see the PlayStation Portable was the highest selling handheld console for PlayStation. Let's move along. For Xbox, the Xbox 360 was the highest selling of all time, but you might be saying to yourself, these charts are great, but I don't know who's selling who comparatively. It's great that I can see Xbox 360. It's great that I can see the Nintendo Wii. I can see that Xbox One and Xbox are here. And I looked at other consoles before these slides. How do we compare across? Well, let's go to the next slide and you'll see kind of what I've done here. So here I've set it up so that you can compare across generations here. So for the 5th generation, you can see Sony in blue beats out everyone with the PlayStation. And so in the 6th generation, Sony again kicks some butt with its PS2. In the 7th generation, though, in red, we have the Nintendo Wii. And so we know how popular the Nintendo Wii was. Nintendo kind of gets the marketplace back. Currently, PlayStation 4 is kicking butt. Sales are double that of the Xbox One. It's not even close. And Nintendo is at about 13.97 million units. For the 9th generation, we only have the Nintendo Switch right now, right? We're waiting to see the consoles that are going to be marketed from Microsoft and from Sony in the future here. However, in only looking at video game consoles, it really doesn't tell the entire story about each company's strategy for the future. To kind of wrap this lecture up, let's take a look at each company's here and now. So that particular chart doesn't really tell the whole story. It's kind of great to know how consoles do against each other from generation to generation. It gives us context, and we get a better understanding of how the video game marketplace is structured, and really who's kicking butt from generation to generation. But these companies are multifaceted and have many, many different desires and many, many different investments. To get a better sense of where these companies are now and where they hope to be, let's look at each company's here and now. So for Nintendo's here and now, we have a few things that have been percolating recently and what it seems like Nintendo is pursuing at the moment. In December 2016, Nintendo entered into the digital mobile gaming sphere with Super Mario Run. Now, traditionally, Nintendo was really against any kind of handheld video game experience that did not go through one of its own branded and licensed and quality regulated handheld devices. You could not convince Nintendo to feature any of its games on any kind of mobile device, smartphone device, or tablet device. This changes with the advent of Super Mario Run. Nintendo capitulates to the market. They recognize that the mobile video game market sphere is growing at an exponential rate. And so Super Mario Run is introduced into the marketplace. It's been downloaded over 200 million times. And so needless to say, this was a hit. Nintendo has not released figures on who actually purchased the entire Super Mario Run game itself, in which Mario is constantly running through a level and you're trying to accrue points. But it is safe to say that the game did what it was supposed to do, which really is to give Nintendo exceptional publicity and allow people to have Mario on their phones. It is currently working on opening a Super Nintendo World with Universal Studios Japan before the Tokyo Olympics in 2020. It plans to also create similar themed worlds at Universal Studios locations in the United States as well. So yes, Super Mario Worlds are coming to theme parks in the United States in the next few years. You may be able to capture a mushroom, you may be able to stomp on a Goomba. We'll see what happens. It also is working on a full-length movie that involves Super Mario Bros. With Illumination Entertainment. This company should be familiar to some of you because they are responsible for the Minions series, the beloved little furry and funky yellow characters that have been featured in several different movies surrounding the Despicable Me series. This movie is slated for a 2022 release. Let's keep going. Microsoft's Here and Now. Now, differently, we recognize that Microsoft is a software company. It has its hands in a lot of different avenues, including computer software and including cloud technology as well. And so Microsoft's a little bit different from Nintendo. It's more of a multifaceted company. And so Microsoft is very much interested in incorporating its Alexa and other virtual assistant features within its own Cortana. So it is moving more and more toward Cortana, its own virtual assistant, and it hopes to kind of implement that into future gaming experiences so that video game players can speak to Cortana and can ask Cortana to do things. Additionally, for the next video game console, they're really hoping to incorporate virtual reality. And so this may come with some sort of headset, or it may come with some sort of device that can help mimic virtual reality. Microsoft has discussed employing its Azure cloud server infrastructure in a project entitled Project Cloud. They want people to be able to not only play video games from clouds and stream gaming from clouds, but to also be able to carry your video games with you from platform to platform, from device to device. So it may very well be that you may start out with a video game console and you might say to your friend Rob, listen man, this is a lot of fun, but you know, we really have to go to the beach, we have to kind of go. Taking that video game experience and not only carrying it with you on some sort of portable device like what the Nintendo Switch does, but taking that video game and being able to just bring it onto your tablet. That's not Microsoft branded. That's not Microsoft licensed. That's just another platform upon which you can enjoy that video game experience. And so this is a market transition from ownership. It's a market transition that also recognizes that consumers are looking for more portability, more control over their experiences, and do not want to carry around devices that are simply meant for a gameplay experience. Just as music has now become platform agnostic, video gameplay is moving toward this realm in which video games are starting to be made for really any kind of device. And that's one of the hopes of a lot of these video game console companies. And so Microsoft is working on all of those elements there. They've also worked to capitalize on video game nostalgia play, especially with Atari. They've released a series of Atari video games. Xbox has also launched 2 subscription services. Microsoft has offered its consumers Xbox Game Pass, which is a subscription service that offers consumers access to a whole library of video games. And so Microsoft has been able to innovate here over and over again with its subscription services. The other one being Xbox Live, which allows consumers to gain access to free games and to play beta versions as well. That's slated at $60 a month. Let's move on to Sony's Here and Now. So for PlayStation's Here and Now, it's elected to discontinue making the PlayStation Vita in 2019. This is very bizarre because much of its leadership has been interested in pursuing handheld devices. And so many of its newly elected leaders are, again, interested in actually re-entering this marketplace. So it remains to be seen what PlayStation is actually going to do here. Very much similar to Microsoft, PlayStation also has 2 different subscription services. It has the PlayStation Plus, which affords its consumers access to discounts, free video games, and cloud storage. And it also has PlayStation Now, which allows its subscribers to kind of access an entire library. So you're seeing with Microsoft and Sony that there are two-tiered subscription services for each video game console. One service is access to its entire library. Another service is having access to other features. Could be more cloud storage. It could be playing games before they're launched. It could be playing beta versions of games. It could be getting free games. And so that seems to be very much indicative of the current consumer behavior-driven video gameplay, in which consumers are learning that they can have access to an entire library, which makes sense for a lot of gamers, or being ahead of the curve. And so each subscription model is indicative of that. Now, the PlayStation Vue is a very, very interesting development for Sony. It is meant to have kind of a bundled package of channels and other entertainment services. It's kind of interesting that a hardware company that is fully invested in gaming would also invest in television and original content series, and also acquiring different kinds of intellectual property. But the PlayStation Vue comes into the marketplace as really one of the first skinny bundle options available to consumers. And it does highlight the last thing that I kind of want to note here. Video game companies, for as interactive as they want to be, and for as entertainment specific as they want to be, are working tirelessly to become those entertainment juggernauts that can really become a one-stop shop for consumers. And so for the PlayStation Vue, the goal is not only to offer consumers video gameplay experiences and interactive experiences, but it's to keep them. How do we keep them? Well, if you've played a video game, you kind of want to chill out and watch TV, we can keep you on the PlayStation by offering you said television and said movies. And so Sony takes on almost this Walmart or kind of Target model in which it is a one-stop shop for entertainment. And a lot of other video game console companies have taken wind of this and have looked into pursuing other multifaceted entertainment enterprises. And so with Nintendo pursuing movies, with Microsoft pursuing cloud technology and becoming platform agnostic, each of these video game console companies is working ridiculously hard in trying to ensure that it is perceived, each one of them is perceived as an entertainment entity, as an entertainment enterprise that from soup to nuts can offer consumers anything from passive entertainment to interactive entertainment. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing, keep learning.